Sheriff Art Schlay and Captain Lloyd Upholstered pushed open the door of Ed Gein's dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of Plainfield, Wisconsin, on the evening of November 16, 1957, searching for evidence related to the disappearance of 58-year-old hardware store owner Bernice Worden, and what they discovered in the dim light of their flashlights would become one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. In the summer kitchen attached to the main house, hanging from the ceiling by ropes tied around her ankles, was Bernice Worden's headless, gutted corpse, dressed like a deer during hunting season, her torso split open from genitals to sternum, her internal organs removed, her head missing. As the officers ventured deeper into the farmhouse, their flashlights revealed a nightmare beyond comprehension. Human skulls converted into soup bowls, chair seats upholstered with human skin, a shoebox containing 9 preserved vulvas, lampshades made from human faces, a belt made of human nipples, a sheath made from human skin for a hunting knife, a mammary vest created from the torso skin of a woman, complete with breasts, 4 noses in a cup, 9 death masks made by carefully peeling the facial skin from skulls and preserving them, a pair of lips on a window shade drawstring, and, perhaps most disturbing, a full bodysuit made from the skin of women, a woman suit, that 51-year-old Ed Gein had been wearing to transform himself into his dead mother. Police would spend 3 days cataloging the horrors inside the Gein farmhouse, discovering body parts and human remains incorporated into nearly every aspect of Ed's daily life. He had been eating from bowls made of human skulls, sitting on chairs covered in human skin, wearing masks made from women's faces, sleeping under blankets decorated with human remains. Ed Gein, the quiet, awkward handyman who had lived his entire life on his family's remote farm, who was known around Plainfield as harmless and simple-minded, who babysat neighbors' children and did odd jobs around town, had been living in a house of horrors for over a decade, robbing graves to collect female corpses, dismembering them, preserving their parts, creating artifacts from their remains, and murdering at least 2 women when fresh corpses weren't available. The discovery would shock America, generate international headlines, inspire countless books and films including Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Thomas Harris's The Silence of the Lambs, and fundamentally change how society understood the psychology of serial killers and the depths of human depravity. At his trial in 1968, Ed would be found guilty of first-degree murder but legally insane, spending the rest of his life in psychiatric institutions where he remained unrepentant and matter-of-fact about his crimes, telling psychiatrists he had simply been trying to recreate his beloved mother Augusta, to literally wear her skin and become her, because he couldn't bear to live in a world without her presence. This is the story of Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield whose crimes were so grotesque that even hardened police officers required counseling, whose case changed criminal psychology forever, and whose farmhouse of horrors proved that sometimes the monster next door is far worse than anything Hollywood could imagine. If you're watching this video, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, the second son of George Philip Gein and Augusta Wilhelmine Lerke Gein. From the moment of his birth, Ed's life would be shaped by his mother's extreme religious fanaticism, his father's alcoholism and failures, and the isolation and abuse that would warp his developing mind into something capable of unimaginable horror. Augusta Gein was a Lutheran fundamentalist who believed the world was sinful, that women outside her own family were instruments of the devil, that sex was evil except for procreation, and that she alone could provide proper guidance for her sons. George Gein was a violent alcoholic who could barely support his family, working sporadically as a tanner and carpenter while spending most of his money on drink. The Gein family lived in poverty in La Crosse until 1915, when Augusta used money she had saved from taking in sewing and laundry to purchase a 195-acre farm outside the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. The farm was remote, located on a dirt road miles from the nearest neighbor, with no electricity, no telephone, and no modern conveniences. Augusta chose this location deliberately. She wanted to isolate her sons from the corrupting influences of the outside world, to raise them in an environment where she had complete control over every aspect of their lives. Ed's older brother Henry was born in 1901, 5 years before Ed. Both boys grew up under their mother's oppressive control, forbidden from making friends, forbidden from talking to girls, forced to attend daily Bible readings where Augusta would preach for hours about the evils of women, alcohol, and the modern world. Augusta particularly focused on passages describing women as instruments of Satan, teaching her sons that all women except herself were whores and harlots who would lead men to damnation. Ed worshipped his mother. Unlike Henry, who recognized Augusta's fanaticism and occasionally pushed back against her control, Ed believed every word his mother preached. He saw Augusta as perfect, pure, the only good woman in an evil world. He lived for her approval, following her every command, accepting her teachings without question. When Augusta praised him, Ed felt joy. When she criticized him, Ed felt devastated. His entire sense of self-worth was tied to his mother's opinion of him. At school, Ed was mocked and bullied relentlessly. He had a lazy eye, a tendency to laugh inappropriately at nothing, and poor social skills that made him an easy target. Teachers noted that Ed was of average intelligence but seemed odd and disconnected, often staring off into space during lessons. He had no friends. Augusta forbade him from socializing with other children. And even if she had allowed it, Ed's strange behavior and awkwardness made friendship impossible. He would sometimes laugh suddenly during serious moments, giggle when someone was hurt, and show emotions that didn't match the situation. Ed's father George died in 1940 at age 66 from heart failure, likely exacerbated by decades of alcoholism. His death barely affected Ed. George had been a distant, often absent figure, someone Ed had been taught to view with contempt. Augusta told her sons that George's death was God's judgment on his sinful life, and Ed accepted this explanation without question. After George's death, Augusta, Ed, and Henry ran the farm together, though Augusta did less physical labor as she aged, instead focusing on maintaining absolute control over her sons' lives. She continued her daily Bible readings, her sermons about sin and evil women, and her insistence that Ed and Henry remain pure and apart from the corrupting world outside the farm. In 1944, tragedy struck when Henry Gein died under suspicious circumstances. On May 16th, Ed and Henry were fighting a brush fire on their property that had gotten out of control. Ed later told police that he and Henry had been separated while fighting the fire, and that when the fire was extinguished, he couldn't find Henry. Police organized a search party, and when they asked Ed where he had last seen his brother, Ed led them directly to Henry's body, which was found face down in an area that hadn't burned, with bruises on his head that looked inconsistent with death by smoke inhalation or fire. The county coroner ruled Henry's death as asphyxiation from smoke, though the bruises were never fully explained. Many investigators later believed Ed had killed Henry, possibly because Henry had begun openly criticizing their mother, suggesting she was mentally ill and that they should commit her to an asylum. Ed would have viewed such talk as blasphemy. But without conclusive evidence, Henry's death was ruled accidental, and Ed was never charged. Henry's death left Ed alone with his mother, exactly as he wanted. For the next year, Ed and Augusta lived together on the farm, with Ed devoted entirely to caring for his aging mother and maintaining the property. But on December 29, 1945, Augusta suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. Ed cared for her obsessively, doing everything for her, but Augusta was angry and bitter about her condition, lashing out at Ed, calling him worthless and weak. Then, on March 1946, Augusta suffered a second, more severe stroke. She died with Ed at her bedside, her last words criticizing him for some minor failing. Augusta's death destroyed Ed. At age 39, he had lost the only person who had ever mattered to him, the woman who had defined his entire existence. Ed was devastated, lost, unable to cope with a world that didn't include his mother's presence. He sealed off the rooms Augusta had used, her bedroom, the parlor, the kitchen, leaving them exactly as they had been, as shrines to her memory. He moved into a small area of the house, living in squalor, eating out of cans, rarely cleaning, the house deteriorating around him. Ed tried to continue his life, doing odd jobs around Plainfield, handyman work, babysitting for neighbors, farm labor. People in town viewed Ed as harmless, if strange. He was polite, soft-spoken, eager to please. Parents trusted him to watch their children. Farmers hired him for seasonal work. No one suspected that Ed was slowly descending into madness. In 1947, approximately 2 years after Augusta's death, Ed began visiting the Plainfield Cemetery and other local cemeteries at night. He would target the graves of recently buried women, particularly women who resembled his mother or whom he remembered from his childhood. Using a shovel, Ed would dig up the graves, a process that took several hours, open the caskets, and remove the bodies or body parts. He later told police he would enter a trance-like state during these grave robberies, guided by what he believed were his mother's instructions. Ed would bring the bodies or body parts back to his farmhouse and begin the process of dismemberment and preservation. He taught himself crude taxidermy and preservation techniques using salt, formaldehyde, and other chemicals to prevent the remains from decomposing. He would carefully peel the skin from skulls to create masks, remove skulls to convert into bowls, take long strips of skin to use as materials for crafts and furnishings. Over the next decade, Ed robbed at least 9 graves and possibly more. He admitted to police that he couldn't remember exact numbers because he would enter fugue states during the robberies. Police later exhumed 3 graves Ed identified and found them as he described. One completely empty, one empty with a few bones and Ed's crowbar left behind, and one with most of the body missing. But corpses from graves presented problems for Ed. They were often partially decomposed, they smelled too bad, as Ed later explained, and they weren't fresh. So, on December 8, 1954, Ed committed his first murder. On December 8, 1954, 51-year-old Mary Hogan closed her tavern in Pine Grove, Wisconsin, a small community about 6 miles from Plainfield, at approximately 4:00 p.m. Mary ran Hogan's Tavern, a popular local establishment where farmers, loggers, and townspeople gathered to drink beer, play cards, and socialize. She was a heavy-set woman with a robust personality, known for her no-nonsense attitude and her ability to handle rowdy customers. Mary lived alone in an apartment above the tavern, her husband having died years earlier, and she had no children. That December afternoon, as dusk settled over the snow-covered Wisconsin landscape, Ed Gein walked into Hogan's Tavern carrying a .32 caliber revolver he had purchased weeks earlier. The tavern was empty except for Mary, who was behind the bar counting money and preparing to leave for the day. Ed had been watching Mary for weeks, observing her routine, noting when she was alone, planning how he would kill her. He needed a fresh body. The corpses from graves were too decomposed, and his mother's voice in his head demanded he continue his work creating his collection of human remains. Ed approached the bar and asked Mary for a drink. As she turned to pour it, Ed raised the revolver and shot her in the head at close range. The bullet entered behind her right ear, killing her almost instantly. Mary collapsed behind the bar, blood pooling on the wooden floor. Ed stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, looking at what he had done. Then, as he later described to police, he entered a trance-like state, guided by what he believed were his mother's instructions. He dragged Mary's body through the tavern to the back door where he had parked his truck. The drag marks left a long trail of blood across the tavern floor. Ed loaded Mary's body into the bed of his truck, covered it with a tarp, and drove back to his farm, the 6-mile journey taking approximately 15 minutes on the dark country roads. At the farmhouse, Ed brought Mary's body into the summer kitchen, the attached shed where he did his butchering and preservation work. He hung her body from the ceiling by ropes tied around her ankles, just as hunters hang deer during hunting season, and used his hunting knife to cut her throat and drain her blood. Then Ed began the systematic dismemberment. He decapitated Mary's head, removed her internal organs, cut away her skin, and carefully processed every part of her body for his collection and his projects. Mary's head was preserved and stored. Her skin was used to create various items. Her organs were kept in jars. Her bones were saved for future use. The process took Ed several hours, working methodically in the dim light of kerosene lamps as the farmhouse had no electricity. The next morning, a customer arrived at Hogan's Tavern expecting it to be open and found the door unlocked but Mary nowhere to be seen. The customer noticed the blood trail across the floor, the pool of blood behind the bar, and a spent shell casing. He immediately drove to Pine Grove and reported what he had found to local police. Deputies arrived and quickly determined this was a murder scene. The blood evidence was clear, and Mary Hogan had disappeared. But despite an extensive investigation, police had no suspects and no leads. Several people were questioned, including Ed Gein, who was known to occasionally visit the tavern, but Ed's demeanor was so meek and harmless that investigators never seriously considered him a suspect. The case went cold. For the next 3 years, Ed continued his life in Plainfield while living secretly with Mary Hogan's remains incorporated into his house of horrors. He continued doing odd jobs around town, babysitting for neighbors and maintaining his facade as a simple, harmless handyman. People found Ed strange but never threatening. He would sometimes make inappropriate comments or laugh at odd times, but folks attributed this to his isolated upbringing and his social awkwardness. Parents trusted Ed to watch their children. Store owners hired him for small jobs. No one suspected that Ed was living in a farmhouse filled with human remains, that he was wearing masks made from women's faces, that he had murdered Mary Hogan and dismembered her body. During these years, from 1954 to 1957, Ed continued robbing graves when opportunities arose. He would visit cemeteries, identify recently buried women who resembled his mother or whom he remembered from his youth, and return at night to exhume their bodies. The grave robbing became more difficult as Ed aged. He was in his late 40s by this time, and digging through frozen ground in Wisconsin winters was physically demanding. Ed later told psychiatrists that this difficulty, combined with his need for fresh corpses that weren't decomposed, led him to commit his second murder. On November 16, 1957, Ed Gein walked into Worden's hardware store in Plainfield at approximately 8 a.m. The store was owned by Bernice Worden, a 58-year-old widow who had run the business since her husband's death. Bernice was well liked in Plainfield, known for her fair prices and friendly service. Her son, Frank Worden, was a deputy sheriff with the Waushara County Sheriff's Department. That morning, November 16th, was the opening day of deer hunting season in Wisconsin, a major event in the state with most stores closing and most men heading into the woods to hunt. Bernice had planned to keep the store open for part of the morning before closing to visit her sister. Ed had been planning Bernice's murder for weeks. He knew she would be alone on opening day of deer season, knew that her son Frank would be busy with his deputy duties, knew this was his opportunity. Ed entered the store carrying a .22 caliber rifle he owned. Bernice greeted him pleasantly. Ed was a regular customer who occasionally bought supplies for odd jobs. Ed asked to look at antifreeze, and as Bernice turned to show him where it was located, Ed raised the rifle and shot her in the head. The bullet entered the back of her head, killing her instantly. Bernice collapsed to the floor behind the counter. Ed locked the front door of the store from the inside, pulled down the shades, and then calmly went about preparing Bernice's body for transport. He found a receipt book and tore out the last receipt written, the last customer before Ed had been a farmer buying supplies early that morning. Ed wanted to cover his tracks, eliminate evidence that he had been there. Then Ed dragged Bernice's body through the store to the loading dock and back where he had parked his truck. He loaded her body into the bed, covered it with a tarp, and drove back to his farm. At the farmhouse, Ed took Bernice's body to the summer kitchen and began the same process he had used with Mary Hogan 3 years earlier. He hung Bernice from the ceiling by ropes around her ankles, decapitated her, eviscerated her, and began skinning and dismembering her body. But Ed made a mistake. He hadn't realized that Bernice kept meticulous sales records, hadn't considered that her son Frank was a deputy sheriff who would immediately investigate her disappearance, and hadn't anticipated that Frank Worden would recognize Ed's name on a sales slip for antifreeze from the previous day when Ed had been in the store ostensibly comparing prices. When Bernice didn't arrive at her sister's house as planned that afternoon, her sister became concerned and called Frank Worden. Frank immediately drove to the hardware store and found it locked with the shades drawn, which was unusual. He unlocked the door with his key and entered to find blood on the floor behind the counter, signs of a struggle, and his mother missing. Frank's training as a deputy kicked in. He immediately secured the scene and called Sheriff Art Schlay. When they examined the store's sales records, they found that the last transaction written had been torn from the receipt book, but on the back of the remaining stub, Bernice had written antifreeze, and what appeared to be the beginning of a name. G. Frank Worden immediately thought of Ed Gein, who had been in the store the previous day asking about antifreeze. Sheriff Schlay agreed. Ed was known to be odd, and they should at least question him. But when they drove to Ed's farm, they found he wasn't home. Ed had gone to visit his neighbor's wife, spending the afternoon and evening helping her with chores and eating dinner with her family, establishing an alibi and acting completely normal while Bernice Worden's partially dismembered corpse hung in his summer kitchen just a few hundred yards away. Sheriff Schlay and Captain Lloyd Forster decided to search Ed's property while waiting for him to return. They approached the farmhouse with flashlights as darkness fell, pushing open the door to the summer kitchen. What they found in the beam of their flashlights would become one of the most infamous crime scene discoveries in American history. Hanging from the ceiling, suspended by ropes around her ankles with her head missing and her body split open from genitals to sternum, was Bernice Worden's corpse. Sheriff Schlay later said he vomited immediately upon seeing the body, his stomach unable to process the horror before him. As Schlay and Forster ventured deeper into the farmhouse, their flashlights revealed nightmare after nightmare. The house was filthy, piled with garbage, empty tin cans, old newspapers, and debris. But scattered throughout this squalor were the trophies of Ed's decade-long collection of human remains. On the kitchen table sat 4 chairs. The seats of 2 chairs were upholstered with human skin, preserved and stretched across the frames. In a closet, investigators found a full human skeleton hanging from a hanger. In the pantry, they found skulls converted into soup bowls. The tops of the skulls had been carefully cut off, the contents removed, and the bowls appeared to have been used for eating. On a table in the living room was a shoebox containing 9 vulvas preserved in salt, arranged carefully like collectibles. In the bedroom, investigators found lampshades made from human facial skin. The skin had been carefully preserved, stretched over wire frames, and the features of the faces were still partially recognizable. A waste basket was covered in human skin. A tom-tom drum had been fashioned with human skin stretched across it. A belt was made from human nipples sewn together. A sheath for a hunting knife was made from human skin. And hanging in a closet like an article of clothing was what investigators initially thought was a costume. It was a full bodysuit made from the skin of women. A woman suit, complete with breasts, genitals, and a female torso that Ed could wear to literally become a woman, to become his mother. Additional discoveries included death masks, human faces that had been carefully peeled from skulls and preserved, with the features intact, some still showing expressions. 9 of these masks were found, some hanging on walls, others stored in boxes. A pair of lips was tied to a string on a window shade. 4 noses were in a cup in the kitchen. Parts of human skulls were mounted on bedposts. Throughout the house, human remains were incorporated into daily life. Ed had been living with, using, wearing, and surrounded by human body parts for over a decade. The inventory of human remains found at Ed Gein's farmhouse was extensive and shocking. 4 noses in a cup, 9 death masks made from human faces, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso including breasts, leggings made from human skin, masks made from human faces with hair attached, Mary Hogan's head in a paper bag, Mary Hogan's face mask in a paper bag, Bernice Worden's entire head in a burlap sack, 9 vulvas in a shoebox, a young girl's dress with vulva attached, a belt made from human nipples, human skin covering several chair seats, a lampshade covered with human skin, a sheath for a hunting knife made from human skin, human lips used as a window shade pull, and a box containing skull caps in a paper bag. Police spent 3 days cataloging the crime scene, with investigators wearing gas masks due to the overwhelming smell of decomposition and preservatives. Photographers documented every item, though many of the photographs were so disturbing they were sealed from public view for decades. Medical examiners and forensic specialists examined the remains, determining that body parts from at least 15 different people were present in the house, though the exact number was difficult to establish because remains were often incomplete. Ed Gein was arrested at his neighbor's house later that evening. When deputies arrived to take him into custody, Ed asked calmly what he was being arrested for. When told it was for the murder of Bernice Worden, Ed replied, "Somebody framed me." But when confronted with the overwhelming evidence found at his farmhouse, Ed's denials quickly gave way to matter-of-fact confession. At the Waushara County Jail, Ed admitted to killing Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan. He explained his grave-robbing activities, identifying at least 9 graves he had robbed, including several from the Plainfield Cemetery. He described how he would enter trance-like states and follow what he believed were his mother's instructions to collect female remains. He explained that he had been trying to recreate his mother, to literally become her by wearing a woman's suit made from skin. Ed showed no remorse during his confession. He spoke matter-of-factly about murdering 2 women, robbing 9 graves, dismembering bodies, and creating artifacts from human remains. He described the process as though discussing carpentry or farming, just tasks that needed to be done. Psychiatrists who examined Ed in the days after his arrest found him cooperative but emotionally flat, showing no understanding that his actions were horrific or abnormal. Ed believed he had been doing what was necessary, what his mother would have wanted. The discovery at Ed Gein's farmhouse generated international headlines. News of the butcher of Plainfield spread rapidly, with newspapers and radio broadcasts describing the house of horrors in graphic detail. The story had everything that captivated public attention: a quiet small town, a seemingly harmless neighbor, a farmhouse filled with human remains, and crimes so grotesque they seemed impossible. Plainfield, a town of fewer than 700 people, was suddenly the center of worldwide attention. Thousands of curious onlookers drove to Plainfield hoping to see Ed's farmhouse or get close to the crime scene. Ed Gein was arraigned on November 21, 1957, on 1 count of first-degree murder for the killing of Bernice Worden. He entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The court ordered psychiatric evaluations to determine if Ed was mentally competent to stand trial and to assess his sanity at the time of the crimes. Multiple psychiatrists examined Ed over the following months, and their findings were consistent. Ed Gein was suffering from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia, and was not mentally competent to stand trial. In January 1958, Judge Herbert A. Bundy ruled that Ed Gein was mentally incompetent to stand trial and ordered him committed to Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security psychiatric facility. Ed would remain institutionalized there for the next decade, receiving psychiatric treatment and medication, while forensic psychiatrists continued evaluating whether he would ever be competent to face trial. While Ed was institutionalized, his farmhouse became a macabre tourist attraction. Thousands of people visited, taking photographs, attempting to enter the property, and stealing pieces of the building as souvenirs. The property owners, disgusted by the attention and the association with Ed's crimes, attempted to sell the farmhouse at auction in 1958. But before the auction could be completed, the farmhouse mysteriously burned to the ground on March 20, 1958. Arson was suspected. Many believed Plainfield residents had burned it to rid the town of this horrible reminder, but no one was ever charged. All that remained was the foundation and the summer kitchen where Bernice Worden's body had been found. Throughout the 1960s, Ed remained at Central State Hospital, undergoing treatment and evaluation. He participated in psychiatric sessions, took antipsychotic medications, and gradually his mental state stabilized somewhat. By 1968, psychiatrists determined that while Ed still suffered from mental illness, he had improved enough to be considered competent to stand trial, meaning he could understand the charges against him, communicate with his attorney, and participate in his defense. Ed Gein's trial began on November 7, 1968, in Waushara County Court, 11 years after his arrest. Due to the sensational nature of the case and concerns about finding an impartial jury, Ed's attorney requested a bench trial, meaning the case would be decided by Judge Robert H. Golmar rather than a jury. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Earl Killeen, presented overwhelming evidence of Ed's guilt in the murder of Bernice Worden, the physical evidence from the crime scene, Ed's confession, the remains found at his farmhouse. But the real question at trial wasn't whether Ed had killed Bernice Worden. He had clearly done so and admitted it. The question was whether Ed had been legally insane at the time of the murder. Wisconsin law, like most states, followed the Manhattan Rule for determining legal insanity. A defendant is legally insane if, at the time of the offense, he was suffering from a mental disease or defect that rendered him unable to understand the nature and quality of his actions, or unable to distinguish right from wrong. The defense called multiple psychiatrists who testified that Ed suffered from schizophrenia, characterized by delusions, hallucinations, and a complete break from reality. They argued that Ed genuinely believed he was following his mother's instructions, that he couldn't distinguish between right and wrong, and that he was legally insane when he killed Bernice Worden. The prosecution countered with their own psychiatric experts who testified that while Ed was mentally ill, he understood that murder was wrong, evidenced by the fact that he had hidden his crimes, lied to investigators, and torn the receipt from Bernice's sales book to cover his tracks. These actions, prosecutors argued, demonstrated that Ed knew his behavior was criminal and took steps to avoid detection, which meant he wasn't legally insane under the Manhattan Rule. On November 14, 1968, Judge Golmar delivered his verdict, guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Bernice Worden. But immediately after the guilty verdict, a second phase of the trial began to determine Ed's sanity. After hearing additional testimony from both prosecution and defense psychiatric experts, Judge Golmar ruled on November 14 that Ed Gein was not guilty by reason of insanity and ordered him committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane for the rest of his life. Ed was found guilty of the act of murder but not criminally responsible due to his mental illness. Judge Golmar explained in his ruling that due to the prohibitive costs and the certainty of the same outcome, Ed would only be tried for the murder of Bernice Worden, though he had admitted to also killing Mary Hogan. The grave robbing and desecration charges were never prosecuted. Ed Gein would spend the remainder of his life in psychiatric institutions, never facing trial for Mary Hogan's murder or for the 9 graves he admittedly robbed. Ed was transferred from Central State Hospital to the Mendota State Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin, in the late 1970s, a medium-security psychiatric facility where he lived in relative comfort. He had his own room, participated in recreational activities, watched television, and received regular visitors, including some reporters and true crime writers. Ed was by most accounts a model patient, polite, cooperative, and no longer displaying the behaviors that had led to his institutionalization. But he also showed no genuine remorse for his crimes, no real understanding of why what he had done was so horrific. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died at Mendota State Hospital at age 77 from respiratory failure due to lung cancer and heart disease. He had spent 26 years institutionalized following his arrest, dying quietly in a psychiatric hospital bed rather than in prison. Ed's body was buried in Plainfield Cemetery next to his mother Augusta, the woman who had shaped his entire life, whose death had triggered his descent into madness, and whom he had spent over a decade trying to recreate and become. The grave was unmarked to discourage vandalism and souvenir hunters, but over the years, people discovered its location and the headstone was repeatedly stolen. In 2000, the headstone was stolen yet again and later recovered when someone attempted to sell it on eBay. It's now held by a law enforcement museum. Ed Gein's final resting place remains unmarked, his gravesite known only to cemetery staff. The impact of Ed Gein's crimes on American culture cannot be overstated. The case became the inspiration for countless books, films, and fictional characters. Author Robert Bloch, who lived 35 miles from Plainfield, was inspired by the Gein case to write his 1959 novel Psycho about Norman Bates, a motel owner who kills women while dressed as his dead mother. Alfred Hitchcock adapted Bloch's novel into his iconic 1960 film Psycho, which became one of the most influential horror films ever made. The character of Norman Bates, with his twisted relationship with his mother and his taxidermy hobby, was directly inspired by Ed Gein. Tobe Hooper's 1974 film, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, drew heavily from Ed Gein's case. While the plot isn't based on Gein's crimes, the character of Leatherface, who wears masks made from human skin, and the farmhouse filled with human remains were directly inspired by the discoveries at Ed's farmhouse. Author Thomas Harris was influenced by the Gein case when creating the character of Buffalo Bill in his novel The Silence of the Lambs, about a killer who skins women to create a woman's suit. The Ed Gein case also fundamentally changed how law enforcement and psychiatrists understood serial killers and extreme criminal behavior. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, founded in 1972, studied the Gein case extensively as part of their development of criminal profiling techniques. Ed's crimes demonstrated that serial killers could be ordinary-looking people living seemingly normal lives while harboring extremely disturbed psychology. The case showed the importance of taking seriously warning signs like animal cruelty, social isolation, and obsessive relationships with parents. For the town of Plainfield, the Ed Gein case left scars that never fully healed. The town's reputation was forever changed. Plainfield became known as the home of one of America's most grotesque killers. The families of Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden suffered not just the loss of their loved ones, but the knowledge that their remains had been violated in the most horrific ways imaginable. The residents who had known Ed, who had hired him for odd jobs and trusted him with their children, struggled with guilt and betrayal. Ed Gein remains, nearly 70 years after his arrest, one of the most notorious criminals in American history. Not because of the number of people he killed — he murdered 2 and robbed 9 graves — but because of what he did with the bodies. The human skull bowls, the lampshades made from faces, the woman suit, These artifacts of Ed's crimes captured public imagination and revulsion in ways that influenced how society thinks about and depicts psychopathic killers. Ed Gein proved that monsters are real, that they can live quietly among us, and that the depths of human depravity can exceed anything fiction could imagine. The crime scene at Ed Gein's farmhouse required 3 full days of investigation and documentation, with forensic teams, medical examiners, photographers, and law enforcement officers from multiple agencies working around the clock to catalog the horrors contained within the dilapidated structure. The smell inside was overwhelming, a combination of decomposition, formaldehyde, salt, and other preservatives Ed had used, mixed with the general squalor of a house that hadn't been properly cleaned in over a decade. Investigators wore gas masks and had to take frequent breaks outside to breathe fresh air and compose themselves before returning to document additional findings. Sheriff Art Schlay, who discovered Bernice Worden's hanging corpse, was so traumatized by what he saw that he suffered nightmares for the rest of his life. In the days following the discovery, Schlay reportedly assaulted Ed during interrogation, banging his head against a brick wall in rage and disgust at what Ed had done. This assault would later have significant legal consequences. Ed's initial confession was ruled inadmissible in court because it had been obtained after Schlay's assault. Many who knew Schlay said the horror of Gein's crimes, combined with the guilt of having compromised the investigation through his assault, led directly to Schlay's fatal heart attack in 1968 at age 43, just months before Ed's trial was scheduled to begin. The inventory of human remains found at the farmhouse was meticulously documented by investigators. In the kitchen, they found 4 noses stored in a cup on the counter. The noses had been carefully cut from faces and preserved in salt, their cartilage still intact, positioned upright in the cup like grotesque collectibles. The condition of the noses suggested they had been removed relatively recently, as they showed minimal decomposition. Forensic examination would later determine these noses belonged to 4 different women whose graves Ed had robbed between 1947 and 1957. The 9 death masks, human faces that had been carefully peeled from skulls, were found in various locations throughout the house. Some hung on walls like hunting trophies, others were stored in boxes in closets. The masks retained the facial features of the deceased women they had been taken from, with eye sockets empty, lips sewn or tied shut, and hair still attached to the scalp portions of the masks. Ed had preserved these masks using a combination of salt curing and formaldehyde treatment, techniques he had learned from books on taxidermy. The masks showed remarkable preservation, with skin that remained supple rather than dried and cracked. Several of the masks still bore expressions. One appeared to be smiling slightly, another looked peaceful as if sleeping, and a third showed what might have been a grimace or expression of pain frozen on the face. Investigators found that Ed had apparently worn these masks regularly. Neighbors would later testify that they had occasionally seen Ed through windows of the farmhouse at night, and what they had dismissed as Ed wearing strange costumes or playing dress-up had actually been Ed wearing the human face masks, literally putting on the faces of dead women. One neighbor recalled seeing what she thought was a woman in Ed's house, only to realize it was Ed wearing a mask and women's clothing. She had dismissed it as Ed having a female visitor, never imagining the horrific reality. The lampshades made from human skin were particularly disturbing artifacts. Ed had carefully removed large sections of skin from the torsos and thighs of corpses, treated the skin to prevent decomposition, and stretched it over wire frames to create functioning lampshades. The skin had been tanned and preserved until it resembled leather, with the natural texture and pores still visible. Some of the lampshades showed discoloration patterns and birthmarks that had been present on the original bodies. These lampshades had been in active use. Several were positioned on lamps throughout the house, and investigators noted that light bulbs beneath them showed they had been recently used. The idea that Ed had been sitting in his living room reading or eating under the light filtered through human skin lampshades was particularly chilling. The woman suit, found in Ed's bedroom, was perhaps the most disturbing artifact recovered from the crime scene. It was not a costume or an approximation. It was an actual suit made from the skin of real women, crafted so Ed could wear it and literally become a woman. The suit consisted of a vest made from a complete female torso, preserved with breasts intact and positioned where they would naturally hang on a living body. A separate section formed leggings made from the skin of women's legs. Most horrifyingly, the suit included preserved female genitalia that could be worn by Ed to create the full illusion of female anatomy. The suit showed signs of regular wear. The skin was supple from handling, and there were marks suggesting it had been put on and taken off repeatedly. Ed later explained to psychiatrists that he would wear the woman's suit in the moonlight in his farmhouse, dancing and moving around while wearing it, believing he was literally becoming his mother Augusta. He described feeling closer to her when wearing the suit, as though her spirit could inhabit him when he wore the skin of women who resembled her. Ed insisted he had never engaged in sexual activity while wearing the suit. His mother had taught him that sex was evil, and he would never dishonor her memory that way. Instead, he wore it as a form of communion with her spirit, a way to keep her alive and present in his life. The chair seats upholstered with human skin demonstrated Ed's bizarre integration of human remains into everyday household items. 2 of the 4 chairs in the kitchen had their fabric seats replaced with human skin that had been carefully cut to size, tanned and preserved, and sewn onto the chair frames using crude but functional stitching. The skin showed wear patterns from use, indicating Ed had actually sat on these chairs regularly during meals. Investigators noted that the skin upholstery included visible features from the original bodies. One chair seat included what appeared to be a preserved navel, and another showed several moles and birthmarks. The bowls made from human skulls were found in the kitchen cupboard alongside ordinary dishes. Ed had cut the tops off 4 skulls, sawing horizontally across the cranium, removed the brain matter, thoroughly cleaned and bleached the bone, and converted them into functional soup bowls. The bone had been polished smooth on the inside, and the bowls showed residue indicating they had been used for eating. One bowl still contained dried food matter from Ed's last meal before his arrest. The skulls used for these bowls belonged to women of various ages based on bone structure and dental analysis. One appeared to be an elderly woman, while another belonged to someone much younger, possibly in her 20s. The belt, made from human nipples, was discovered in Ed's bedroom, hanging in a closet among his ordinary clothing. Ed had carefully removed nipples from the breasts of multiple corpses. The belt contained at least 10 nipples, and had sewn them together using heavy thread to create a functioning belt approximately 30 inches long. The nipples had been preserved and maintained their structure and color, appearing almost lifelike despite being separated from their original bodies. Ed had apparently worn this belt, as it showed wear patterns, and the leather backing showed indentations from a belt buckle. The sheath for Ed's hunting knife was made from human skin, sewn into a tube shape with crude but effective stitching. The inside of the sheath showed oil stains from the knife blade, indicating it had been used regularly. The skin used for the sheath appeared to have come from someone's arm or leg based on its thickness and lack of distinguishing features. This artifact demonstrated Ed's complete normalization of using human remains. He had created a functional tool from human skin and used it regularly during his daily activities without apparent guilt or recognition of wrongness. Throughout the house, investigators found additional body parts stored in various locations. In jars in the pantry, Ed had preserved organs including a heart, lungs, and liver in formaldehyde solution, labeled with handwritten tags indicating which grave they had come from and the date of exhumation. In the refrigerator, an old model that Ed powered with a generator since the farmhouse had no electricity, investigators found additional body parts wrapped in newspaper and butcher paper, stored as if they were cuts of meat. The freezer compartment contained several vulvas preserved in salt, stored in small boxes and carefully maintained. In the bedroom, detectives found a box containing photographs Ed had taken of some of the women whose graves he had robbed. These were not photographs Ed had taken himself. They appeared to be funeral photographs and memorial pictures that Ed had stolen from graves or funeral homes. Ed had apparently studied these photographs before robbing the graves, using them to select victims who resembled his mother. Several of the photographs had notations in Ed's handwriting indicating which graves he had targeted and what remains he had taken. The discovery of Mary Hogan's head was particularly significant for investigators. Mary's head had been found in a paper bag in Ed's bedroom, preserved in salt, with her face mask removed and stored separately. The condition of the head confirmed Ed's confession that he had killed Mary 3 years earlier in 1954. The preservation was remarkable. Mary's features were still recognizable. Her gray hair was intact, and there was relatively little decomposition. Forensic examination revealed the bullet wound behind Mary's ear, confirming Ed's account of how he had killed her. Bernice Worden's severed head was found in a burlap sack in the shed where her body had been hanging. Like Mary Hogan's head, Bernice's head showed Ed's preservation techniques. He had already begun treating it with salt to prevent decomposition. The decapitation had been performed with surgical precision, suggesting Ed had practiced this procedure many times during his years of grave robbing and corpse desecration. Medical examiners noted that Ed knew exactly where to cut to separate the head cleanly from the body with minimal damage to either part. The investigation expanded beyond the farmhouse to the property's outbuildings. In a tool shed, investigators found Ed's collection of grave robbing equipment: shovels with dirt still clinging to them, a pry bar used to open caskets, kerosene lanterns Ed used to see while working at night in cemeteries, and a notebook containing a list of names, women buried in local cemeteries whom Ed was apparently planning to exhume. The notebook included notes about which cemeteries had the easiest access, which had security or night watchmen, and which graves would be easiest to dig up based on soil conditions. Following Ed's confession that he had robbed 9 graves, investigators decided to test his claims by exhuming 3 graves Ed specifically identified. Alan Wilimowski of the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory supervised the exhumations. The first grave, belonging to a woman named Eleanor Adams who had died in 1951, was completely empty. The casket had been opened, and the entire body was gone, with only Ed's crowbar left behind, apparently dropped during the robbery. The second grave, belonging to a woman named Mabel Everson who had died in 1953, contained only scattered bones and fragments. Ed had taken most of the body but had apparently decided some parts weren't useful for his purposes. The third grave, belonging to a woman named Irene Hill who had died in 1950, contained a body with several parts missing. The hands, feet, and head had been removed, but the torso remained, along with jewelry that Ed had apparently replaced after taking the body parts he wanted. These test exhumations confirmed Ed's confession was accurate and suggested he had indeed robbed at least 9 graves, possibly more. Cemetery records showed that all the women Ed targeted had died relatively recently, within 1 to 7 years of being exhumed, because Ed needed bodies that weren't too decomposed for his purposes. Ed specifically targeted women who had died in their 40s, 60s, the same age range as his mother Augusta, and whom he believed resembled her in appearance based on funeral photographs and obituaries. The psychiatric evaluation of Ed Gein began immediately after his arrest and would continue for over a decade before he was deemed competent to stand trial. Dr. E.F. Schubert, a forensic psychiatrist hired by the state, conducted the first extensive evaluation in November and December 1957. Dr. Schubert spent over 40 hours interviewing Ed, administering psychological tests, and observing his behavior. His findings were disturbing. Ed showed no remorse for killing Mary Hogan or Bernice Worden, no understanding that robbing graves and creating artifacts from human remains was abnormal, and no emotional connection to the horror he had created. Ed described his crimes matter-of-factly as if discussing carpentry or farming. When asked why he had killed Bernice Worden, Ed explained calmly that he needed a fresh body because the corpses from graves smelled too bad and were too decomposed to work with properly. He didn't see Bernice as a human being with a life and family. She was simply a source of raw materials for his projects. When asked about Mary Hogan, Ed said he had chosen her because she resembled his mother and because he knew her tavern would be empty in the afternoon. Dr. Schubert asked Ed about the woman suit and Ed's ritual of wearing it. Ed explained that after his mother's death he felt incomplete, as if part of him had died with her. He believed that if he could literally wear a woman's skin, he could become whole again, could become his mother, and thus never be without her. Ed described wearing the suit in the moonlight, dancing through the farmhouse, feeling his mother's presence within him. He said it was the only time he felt peace, the only time the emptiness inside him was filled. When asked about cannibalism, Ed denied eating human flesh. He explained that while he had considered it, believing that consuming someone would make them part of him forever, he ultimately couldn't do it because they smelled too bad, and because his mother had taught him certain taboos about the human body. Ed's explanation was telling. He hadn't refrained from cannibalism because he understood it was morally wrong, but because the practical aspects, the smell, and his mother's specific teachings prevented it. If the bodies had smelled better, or if his mother had never specifically forbidden it, Ed might well have engaged in cannibalism. Dr. Schubert diagnosed Ed with schizophrenia characterized by severe delusions, inability to distinguish fantasy from reality, and a complete detachment from normal human emotional responses. He concluded that Ed was suffering from a mental disease so severe that he was incapable of understanding the wrongfulness of his actions at the time he committed them, and that Ed remained incompetent to stand trial because he couldn't adequately participate in his own defense. Additional psychiatric evaluations by Dr. Milton Miller and Dr. Robert Lund reached similar conclusions. Ed's mental illness was profound and long-standing, likely beginning in childhood and accelerating after his mother's death. The psychiatrists noted that Ed's relationship with Augusta had been pathologically enmeshed. She had been his entire world, and he had internalized her teachings to such an extreme degree that he couldn't function as an independent human being after she died. The grave, robbing, and murders were Ed's desperate attempts to recreate his mother, to bring her back to life, to never be without her again. The psychiatrists also noted Ed's profound social isolation and sexual confusion. Ed had never had a romantic relationship, never expressed sexual attraction to anyone, and seemed to view sexuality through the lens of his mother's teachings that sex was evil and disgusting. His creation of the woman suit and his wearing of it wasn't sexual. It was an attempt at transformation, at literally becoming a woman, his mother, rather than desiring women sexually. Ed's psychology was so warped by his upbringing and mental illness that normal human drives and emotions had been completely subverted. On January 6, 1958, Judge Herbert Bundy formally ruled that Ed Gein was incompetent to stand trial and ordered him committed to Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. Ed would remain there for the next 10 years, undergoing psychiatric treatment, taking antipsychotic medications, and gradually stabilizing to the point where he could potentially face trial. During this time, Ed was a model patient, cooperative, polite, following rules, causing no problems for staff. He participated in therapy sessions, took his medications as prescribed, and engaged in recreational activities available to patients. The years at Central State brought some improvement to Ed's mental state. The antipsychotic medications reduced his delusions and hallucinations. Therapy helped him develop some insight into his mental illness. Though he never fully accepted that his actions were wrong, he understood intellectually that society viewed them as wrong, but he couldn't feel emotionally that they were wrong. Ed told psychiatrists repeatedly that he had simply been trying to bring his mother back, and he couldn't understand why that was considered bad when it had been the most important relationship of his life.